Story 1. In the summer of 1985, a wave of terror swept across Los Angeles as residents faced a string of gruesome attacks. It was the work of one man, Richard Ramirez, later known as the Night Stalker. His methods were unpredictable, his attacks random and brutal, often targeting families as they slept. Ramirez's horrifying spree began one night when he broke into a quiet suburban home, killing the man of the house and assaulting his wife. But it wasn't the brutality of the act alone that haunted people. It was the randomness. Ramirez would sometimes take small items, bits of personal memorabilia, as if leaving behind traces of his twisted presence. What terrified the police and the public alike was how he moved freely, a shadow slipping in and out of locked houses, leaving families violated and forever scarred. Ramirez's attacks were marked by disturbing consistency. He'd leave behind symbols or make chilling statements. The worst part was that his murders grew increasingly brutal, and his lack of a clear pattern made him nearly impossible to track. When the police released sketches of the killer, fear took hold of the entire city. Locks were changed, and people slept with weapons under their pillows. But the Night Stalker continued his reign of terror. Finally, it was the public, not the police, who captured him. One day, after his face was recognized from news reports, he was chased by an angry crowd through the streets of East Los Angeles. The mob finally caught him and held him down until the police arrived, marking the end of a terror-filled summer. But the stories Ramirez left behind, of his twisted obsession with death and his disturbing disregard for human life, haunt Los Angeles to this day. Even after his capture, his legacy remains, and people who lived through that summer still remember the feeling of dread, never knowing who would be next. Story 2. In the early 20th century, the city of New Orleans was gripped by a series of terrifying attacks. It began in 1918 with the brutal murder of a grocer and his wife, found hacked to death in their home. But this was just the beginning. Soon, other families fell victim, all killed with the same brutal precision, using an axe that often belonged to the victim's household. What set the axeman apart wasn't just his violence. It was his twisted sense of theater. In March 1919, the city received a letter supposedly from the killer himself. It taunted the public, warning of another attack. But the letter held an odd request. He claimed he loved jazz music and promised to spare any house where jazz was playing on the night of his next planned attack. The night of terror came, and nearly every household filled the air with jazz, hoping it would save them. The music played into the early hours, and surprisingly, the killer struck no one that night. However, the axeman would return, and with each attack, he left no clues, no motive. Each crime scene was marked by the grotesque image of a family brutally murdered in their home, and each time, the murder weapon was left behind, smeared with blood. As suddenly as he appeared, the axeman vanished in 1919, leaving behind only unanswered questions and fear. To this day, no one knows who he was or why he chose his victims. New Orleans remembers him as a monster who not only took lives, but held an entire city hostage to his whims, leaving behind an unsolved legacy that remains one of the city's darkest mysteries. Story 3. In the quiet Bavarian countryside, the Hinterkaifeck farm lay nestled among dense woods and fields, isolated from its nearest neighbors by miles of farmland. In the winter of 1922, the Gruber family lived there. Andreas and his wife, Cecilia, their widowed daughter Victoria, and her 2 young children. For years, the family had kept to themselves, but in the weeks leading up to their brutal deaths, unsettling events began to plague them. Andreas Gruber had told a neighbor about strange footprints leading from the edge of the woods to his farmhouse, but he hadn't seen any leading back. He had even found a newspaper that none of them recognized inside the house. On another occasion, a set of keys went missing, and strange sounds echoed from the attic late at night. Despite these eerie signs, Andreas never reported anything to the police. He dismissed it as his imagination, though he felt uneasy in his own home. One dark night in March, everything came to a terrifying climax. After days of not seeing any activity at the farm, concerned neighbors decided to check on the Grubers. What they found shook them to their core. Andreas, Cecilia, Victoria, and her 2 children had all been gruesomely murdered with a pickaxe. Their bodies lay arranged in the barn, suggesting they'd been lured there one by one and killed. The youngest child was found in her crib, her face bruised and bloodied, adding to the horror of what had occurred. The crime scene held haunting clues. In the kitchen, it looked as though someone had been eating meals and staying at the farm after the murders. Smoke had been seen coming from the chimney, and food had been prepared. There were signs that the animals had been fed and even cared for in the days following the family's deaths. Whoever committed this crime had made Hinterkaifeck their home, settling among their victims' lifeless bodies. As police began their investigation, the scene only grew more perplexing. They found no signs of forced entry, suggesting that the killer had either used the missing key or had been hiding in the attic, listening to the family's every movement. The attic itself was covered with straw, possibly to muffle the killer's footsteps. Yet despite their thorough search, the police found no solid leads. They questioned neighbors and even family acquaintances, but everyone who knew the Grubers had airtight alibis. Theories about the murders became more disturbing as time went on. One theory was that Victoria's late husband, who had reportedly died in World War I, had actually survived and returned to exact revenge, driven mad by jealousy or betrayal. Another rumor suggested that Andreas Gruber, known to be a strict and often violent man, might have created enemies in his own household, giving rise to internal conflict that exploded into murder. Yet the strangest and most persistent theory revolved around Victoria's relationships. Many believed that her father, Andreas, had an unnatural control over her, and some neighbors speculated about an illicit relationship between father and daughter, something so horrific that it might have driven someone to murderous rage. However, with no evidence to prove any theory, the case remained frozen in mystery. In the years since, many have tried to solve the Hinterkaifeck murders, poring over police records, re-examining evidence, and piecing together what little remains of that fateful night. Paranormal enthusiasts believe the Grubers' spirits haunt the land, forever seeking justice. Those who visit the site claim they feel an overwhelming sadness and sense of dread, as though they're intruding upon something deeply sinister. To this day, the Hinterkaifeck murders remain one of Germany's most chilling unsolved mysteries. With the farmhouse long demolished, all that's left are the stories. Dark, twisted tales of a family whose tragic end continues to haunt the surrounding fields and forests.